Rising from the floodplain of the Mississippi River stands a mound of packed earth taller than a 10-story building. Its base covers more than 14 acres. UNESCO calls it the largest prehistoric earthwork in the Americas. This is Monk's Mound. It stood at the center of the largest city north of Mexico before European colonization. Cahokia's rise remade the Mississippi Valley. Its erasure, centuries later, reshaped how the continent remembered itself. On its flattened summit once stood a large building, roughly 100 feet long. Archaeologists still debate exactly what it was used for: a residence, a temple, perhaps both at different points in the mound's long history. Monk's Mound did not stand alone. It stood at the center of a city. Thousands of people lived in its shadow. A central plaza, large enough for major public gatherings, spread out below it. Archaeologists call this city Cahokia. Most people who drive past it today never know it was there. The land around it is quiet now. Farm fields, a 4-lane highway within sight of the mound itself, a scatter of houses and gas stations. Nothing announces that one of the greatest cities in North American history once stood on this exact ground. What survives today, protected within a state historic site, is only the core. Cahokia's full extent reached further, west through what is now East St. Louis, and across the Mississippi into a third precinct beneath modern St. Louis, Missouri. Archaeologists sometimes call this wider footprint Greater Cahokia. The mounds you can visit are the heart of something considerably larger. Some estimates put the earth in Monk's Mound alone at over 20 million cubic feet. All of it moved by hand. No draft animals, no wheeled carts. Basket load after basket load of soil, carried up a slope that grew steeper with every new layer added. Different layers of the mound show different colors and textures of soil, brought from different places. That detail confirms deliberate, staged construction. Exactly how long the main building program took is still argued over. One chronological model points to major construction happening in less than a single generation. Another allows for several stages spread across many generations, with plant remains read by some researchers as evidence of fairly continuous building. The soil tells us this was planned and deliberate. It doesn't yet tell us, on its own, how long the plan took to complete. No one alive today knows what the people of Cahokia called themselves. They left no writing, no ruler's name carved into stone, no account, in their own words, of who governed here or why they built a mound this size. What they left instead was scale. Around Monk's Mound, Cahokia's builders raised more than 100 smaller mounds. Some were platforms for buildings and public activity. Others held burials or marked significant places. Most Cahokians, though, were not buried in mounds at all. They were buried in ordinary cemeteries, like people almost everywhere. Many of those 100-plus mounds are gone now, plowed flat by 19th and 20th century farming, or destroyed to make way for roads and buildings, long before anyone thought to protect them. What remains today is a fraction of what once stood on this floodplain. This was a city built without iron tools, without draft animals, without wheeled transport. Everything here was carried and shaped by hand, one basket load of earth at a time, across generations. And for a while, it worked, on a scale that still surprises the people who study it closely. copper reached this floodplain from the Great Lakes. Shell arrived from the Gulf Coast. Mica came from the Appalachians. For a few centuries, this floodplain sat at the center of far-reaching networks of exchange. Whatever mix of trade, travel, and gift-giving actually carried those materials here. Then the city emptied. By the time European colonizers reached this stretch of the Mississippi in real numbers, Cahokia's peak was long past. Its mounds stood weathered, overgrown, easy to mistake for natural hills. Some of the newcomers who found them did exactly that, and some refused, for a very long time, to believe the ancestors of the native peoples still living nearby could have built them. That refusal is its own story, and it comes back before the end. For now, this journey takes a while. Settle in. Before Cahokia was a city, this stretch of Mississippi floodplain, archaeologists call it the American Bottom, was already home to something real. People here had been farming for generations. They cultivated native plants long before maize arrived. Chenopod, sunflower, marshmallow, and other crops now grouped under the name Eastern Agricultural Complex. They traded across real distances. They built early mounds. Maize itself had already entered the diet by around 900, more than a century before anything resembling a city existed here. None of this was primitive. It was a working agricultural society with its own trade connections, its own seasonal rhythms, its own small-scale mound building already underway. What changed after 1050 wasn't the invention of civilization here. It was a dramatic acceleration of things already in motion. This was not empty land waiting for history to begin. It was an established world about to reorganize itself with startling speed. A reorganization so fast that later archaeologists, working centuries afterward, would need a name for it that reached for the language of cosmology rather than ordinary historical change. Archaeologist Timothy Pawcattot gave that reorganization a name: the Big Bang. It's a useful label and an influential one, but it's worth being precise about what it actually describes. Around 1050, within roughly a generation, Cahokia's population surged. Estimates vary. The site's own UNESCO listing puts the peak population between 10 and 20,000. But the change was rapid and concentrated, faster than the surrounding region's own history up to that point would have predicted. Pottery styles shifted. Tools changed. Whole neighborhoods were laid out where none had existed. Monumental mound construction accelerated sharply, including the beginning of what would become Monk's Mound. Not every part of Cahokian life changed at exactly the same moment, but a striking number of them changed within the same few decades, which is precisely what makes the Big Bang label, however imprecise, useful. Something did happen quickly here, even if instantaneous overstates it. Some of that growth came from families nearby choosing to move closer to the rising center. Some of it came from much further away. Researchers have analyzed strontium isotopes in the teeth of people buried at Cahokia, a chemical signature absorbed from local water and food during childhood that stays fixed for life. One study found that a substantial share of the individuals sampled, roughly a third, carried signatures that did not match the American bottom. They grew up elsewhere. The isotopes can't say exactly where elsewhere was. They can only say it wasn't here. But that's still a striking finding. Cahokia didn't simply grow from within. Migration was part of how the city formed, not a side effect of its success. Isotope evidence from bone tells a related, separate story. How much maize people were actually eating, and when. That evidence shows maize entering the diet abruptly around 900, then rising sharply over the following centuries. Not one continuous gradual climb, but a fast start, followed by a rapid rise in reliance on one crop above the others. Bone chemistry can show that broad pattern. It can't reconstruct anyone's actual daily meals, or say why any single person ate what they ate, or distinguish a household that farmed maize from one that simply traded for it. Cahokia's growth wasn't confined to one center either. West of the core, in what is now East St. Louis, a second major precinct rose during this same period, its own dense cluster of mounds and residences closely tied to Cahokia, but physically separate from it. Excavations there, often conducted ahead of modern construction projects, have uncovered dense concentrations of structures. Some deliberately burned in events archaeologists still don't fully understand. Recent research increasingly treats Greater Cahokia as polycentric, not one mound surrounded by dependent villages, but multiple linked centers functioning together, including a third precinct across the Mississippi in what is now St. Louis. To the east, in the surrounding uplands, a dense scatter of new settlements appeared alongside the city's rise. Archaeologists call this cluster the Richland Complex. Some of these sites look like ordinary farming communities, their households going about local life with little visible connection to the city nearby. Others contain buildings that closely mirror Cahokian ceremonial architecture, leading some researchers to propose them as outposts of Cahokia's religious reach, planted directly into the countryside. Though that specific reading belongs to particular researchers, not a settled fact about every site in the cluster. What does seem clear is that Cahokia's rise coincided with a broader reorganization of the surrounding region, reaching into farmland and small settlements that, a generation earlier, had looked no different from countless other places along this river. Why did any of this happen? That question doesn't have a settled answer. Some researchers, including Paucatat, argue for a strong concentration of authority behind the transformation, a political shift dramatic enough to explain how so much changed so quickly. Other archaeologists read the same evidence differently and see something less centralized, a broader realignment that a wider circle of people had a hand in shaping. There are more than two camps here, and researchers differ over scale and mechanism, as well as who was driving it. What most models do agree on is that something real reorganized this floodplain around 1050. The disagreement is over its shape, not whether it happened. What isn't disputed is how much intensive maize farming mattered to what followed. As maize became more central to the diet, dense settlement expanded alongside it. That doesn't fully explain why growth arrived so suddenly. But it points to part of how a floodplain that had supported scattered communities for generations could, once the surge began, sustain something urban. Dense neighborhoods, specialized labor, and monumental architecture, all requiring a food supply reliable enough to support people able to spend more of their time on specialized work. A city whose population, at its height, was comparable to many European cities of the same era. No one who lived through this transformation left an account of what it felt like. All that survives is the evidence in the ground and the ongoing argument over what it actually means. Step back from the mounds for a moment. Ask a simpler question. What did it actually feel like to live here? Most Cahokians were not elites. Most of what survives of their lives has nothing to do with rulers or monuments. It comes from something more ordinary: packed dirt floors, discarded pottery, faint post holes marking where walls once stood. The accumulated debris of thousands of unremarkable, ordinary days that archaeologists now piece back together one excavation unit at a time. Cahokia's food system ran deeper than maize alone. Long before maize took hold here, farmers in this region were already cultivating a distinctive set of native plants: chenopod, maygrass, erect knotweed, little barley, sunflower, and marsh elder. Archaeologists call this the Eastern Agricultural Complex, and it represents thousands of years of accumulated agricultural knowledge. Knowledge that predates maize in this region by a very long time. These weren't minor, marginal crops. Chenopod alone could be grown densely and harvested efficiently, its seeds ground into meal much the way maize would later be used. This was a real farming tradition, developed independently of maize agriculture, which arrived here later from farming traditions further south and west. Archaeobotanists studying charred seeds recovered from cooking pits have found these crops present in real quantity, not as an occasional supplement, but as a dietary staple in their own right. Maize didn't introduce farming to Cahokia. It entered an already sophisticated system and gradually became more dominant within it. By the city's peak, maize made up a substantial share of the diet, but squash, native seed crops, and gathered foods remained part of the picture throughout, and the balance between them likely varied from household to household, season to season. The floodplain itself gave generously in most years. Fish from the river and its oxbow lakes, waterfowl during migration seasons, arriving in numbers that would have been spectacular to witness. Deer and smaller game from the surrounding woodland. Nuts gathered in the fall, stored for leaner months. This was not a subsistence diet scraped together at the margins. It was a rich environment, one that could support real population density when farming, fishing, and gathering worked together. It wasn't without risk. The same river that fed this floodplain could also flood it without warning. Abundance here was real, but it was not guaranteed, and it required constant, careful management to sustain a population this size. Homes were modest, single-room structures, typically built using wall trench construction. Walls set into narrow trenches dug into the earth, a technique distinct from the surrounding region's older building styles. Roofs were likely thatched, floors were packed, earth swept and maintained. Neighborhoods and courtyards, rather than a single uniform city grid, seem to have organized how people lived near each other. Small clusters of households, perhaps connected by kinship, arranged around shared outdoor space. Houses were often rebuilt on the same footprint, sometimes repeatedly. That rebuilding shows real continuity of place, people returning to the same ground generation after generation. Whether it was the same family each time, or a broader kin group, or simply a valued piece of ground passed between households, is more than the footprint alone can tell us. Each rebuilding left its own layer of debris behind. Broken pottery, discarded tools, the ordinary residue of daily life that archaeologists now carefully sift through, layer by layer, to reconstruct a sequence of occupation stretching back decades or more at a single small plot of ground. Some neighborhoods show distinct building practices and material traditions, different from their neighbors just a short distance away. That variation may reflect different communities, possibly including newer arrivals, living close together without necessarily blending into one uniform culture. This was a city built, in part, from people who hadn't always lived here. Each brought something of their own, a slightly different way of framing a house wall, a locally distinct style of pottery. Small choices like these, multiplied across a household and passed down, leave a visible signature in the archaeological record centuries later. Work here was varied. Cahokia needed potters. It needed people who could knap stone into tools with precision. It needed bead makers, patient enough to drill thousands of shell discs by hand for burials and ceremonies. It needed people skilled enough to work copper into finished ceremonial objects, a craft the next section looks at closely. Specialized craft work is plausible, even likely, for people whose skill in specific contexts clearly exceeded casual, part-time effort. The kind of precision that comes only from repeated practice, not from an occasional afternoon spent trying something new. Food itself carried real labor, easy to overlook from a distance. Native seed crops had to be harvested, dried, and stored before winter. Maize had to be planted, tended, guarded from birds and animals, then harvested and ground by hand for every single meal. Fish and waterfowl followed their own seasonal windows, changing the rhythm of work around the calendar of the river itself. None of this ran on its own. Every meal here represented hours of prior, unglamorous work. Not everyone here lived the same life, and there's direct physical evidence of that inequality. A study of skeletal remains from Mound 72, one particular burial complex, not the city's population as a whole, found status and sex-linked differences in animal protein signals within that sample. Individuals given more elaborate burial treatment showed signs of a diet richer in meat. It's a small, unusual sample, and status and sex overlap within it in ways that resist a single, clean rule. Whether that same pattern held true across the wider city, among people never buried anywhere near Mound 72, is a separate question the evidence hasn't answered yet. And there was time here for more than labor. Stones for the game chunky have turned up across the site, evidence the game mattered here. Exactly how it was played, whether fields were set aside specifically for it, and whether any given match was purely recreational, ceremonial, political, or wagered on, the evidence doesn't let us say with certainty. Quite possibly, it was all of those things, depending on who was playing and when. A game that could be pure entertainment for one group might, at the same moment, be carrying political weight for another. This was a real city, real neighborhoods, real inequality, real specialized work, and real time for play, ceremony, and competition. Not a monument with people incidentally attached to it, but a place people actually lived, in the ordinary texture of a life that left behind broken pots, worn tools, and the outlines of homes rebuilt again and again on the same patch of ground. Whatever drove Cahokia's rapid growth, what followed it was not chaos. It was design. South of Monk's Mound, Cahokia's builders leveled an open plaza. The State Historic Site's own figure puts it at roughly 40 acres. A later excavation-based reconstruction by Alt, Kruchten, and Pocketot estimates the plaza at something closer to 47 to 59 acres, larger than earlier estimates had suggested. The two figures come from different methods and different reconstructions of the plaza's boundaries, not a disagreement about whether it was engineered. Excavations by that same research team found deliberate fill and leveling beneath its surface. This was engineered ground, not simply cleared open space, a deliberately leveled expanse in a landscape that had not naturally offered one. Its exact uses aren't fully settled. Public gatherings are likely. Some researchers have proposed regular markets as well, though no direct market installation has been confirmed. Cahokians used this plaza in more than one way, though not every use is equally certain. One frequently proposed use is chunky. A player would roll a stone disc across open ground. Others would throw spears toward where it was predicted to stop. Chunky stones, and evidence the game mattered here, have turned up at Mississippian sites hundreds of miles from Cahokia, showing it was part of a broad shared tradition across the wider Mississippian world. Whether Cahokia invented the game, or simply became one of its major centers, or whether the Grand Plaza itself hosted it, isn't something the stones alone can prove. No excavated marker has confirmed an actual playing field here. West of the main precinct, Cahokia's builders raised a circle of tall cedar posts. Archaeologists call it Woodhenge. Its discovery and its leading interpretation both trace back to archaeologist Warren Whitry, who identified multiple successive versions of the post circle and proposed that they tracked solar alignments, solstices and equinoxes marked by specific posts against the horizon. Standing at the circle's center on the right morning, a viewer would see the sun rise directly over a particular post, a striking sight. Visitors can still witness it today, since the post circle stands as a permanent reconstruction, with public sunrise observances held on select dates through the year. That reading has held up well and is widely accepted, though it remains, formally, an interpretation rather than a fully documented civic institution, with known rules, priests, or ceremonies attached to it. East of the city, at a separate site called the Emerald Acropolis, researchers Pocketot, Alt, and Kruchten have proposed something further still. Some of Cahokia's built features, they argue, track not just the sun, but a much slower and harder to observe lunar cycle called a lunar standstill, which occurs roughly every 18.5 years. It's a striking argument tied to a specific site and specific researchers, not a settled fact about Cahokia's built landscape as a whole, and one that continues to generate debate among archaeologists who work on astronomical alignments elsewhere in the Mississippian world. South and east of Monk's Mound, in a cluster of mounds called the Ramey Group, archaeologists located the only confirmed copper workshop found anywhere in the Mississippian world. This alone makes it a remarkable find. Not one example among several, but a single, unique site in an entire cultural world. that otherwise left no comparable evidence of dedicated metalworking space. Analysis of 8 recovered copper fragments from the site shows clear evidence of hammering and repeated annealing, heating native copper, then working it, then reheating it over and over to keep the metal workable without cracking it. Experimental replication by later researchers confirmed this was an effective way to thin native copper into sheets, using nothing more than fire, a hammering stone, and considerable practiced patience. The 8 analyzed fragments don't preserve any finished, identifiable object, just the working process itself, captured mid-craft, the copper's journey from raw metal to something else, interrupted before that something else was finished. Nearby, artisans produced rami-incised pottery, finely made vessels carved with motifs tied to Cahokian religious imagery. This pottery turns up at Mississippian sites far to the north of Cahokia, and the picture there is more interesting than a simple export story. Petrographic analysis of the ceramic fabric in some of these northern vessels shows they weren't shipped from Cahokia at all. They were made locally using local clay by potters who had adopted or reproduced the Cahokian style themselves. So influence here didn't only travel as an object changing hands. Sometimes it traveled as an idea, replicated by a distant potter who may have reshaped its meaning along the way. Exactly what every symbol meant isn't something the pottery itself can settle. That reading belongs to specific researchers' interpretations, not an agreed translation shared by everyone who studies it. One more object worth pausing on, residue recovered from beakers found at Cahokia, contains theobromine, caffeine, and ursolic acid, the chemical signature of a drink made from yaupon holly, a plant that doesn't grow anywhere near the American bottom. It grows far to the south, along the Gulf Coast. Researchers call it black drink. The residue confirms people at Cahokia consumed a yaupon holly beverage, a substance that, chemically, would have produced real physical effects. Its rarity and the ritual contexts of the beakers it was found in has led researchers to propose it was reserved for particular occasions rather than everyday use. Since yaupon doesn't grow anywhere near the American bottom, some form of the plant had to travel hundreds of miles to get here, whether as dried leaves, a prepared concentrate, or something else. The residue itself can't tell us which. What exactly the ceremony involved isn't something the chemistry alone can tell us either. None of this, the plaza, the posts, the copper, the pottery, the imported drink, happened in a city that only fed itself. Copper traced to the Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachians, shell from the Gulf Coast, yaupon holly from far to the south. None of it occurs naturally anywhere near Cahokia. Every piece of it traveled here, through exchange networks reaching across a significant portion of the continent. Evidence of a city that reached outward, and that other communities, in turn, reached back toward. Combined with the isotope evidence from earlier in this account, showing real numbers of non-local people living and dying here, the picture is of a settlement that had, within a lifetime, become impossible for the wider region to ignore. Monumental construction on this scale required real coordination, labor organized and directed toward the same goal. What that coordination actually looked like, day to day, is harder to say. in a city with no surviving written record of its own government, no law code, no royal inscription, nothing except the physical results of whatever decisions were actually made. The physical evidence supports a few things clearly. Burial treatment across Cahokia varied significantly. Some individuals interred with real ceremony and elaborate goods, most far more simply, a difference visible in the ground even when nothing else about a person's life survives. Later in the city's history, a massive wooden palisade was built around the central precinct, reinforced with bastions positioned for defense. That wall may also have marked a social or sacred boundary, separating an inner precinct from the wider city around it. The two readings aren't mutually exclusive. A single wall could easily have served both purposes at once, keeping out threats while also marking, for anyone who lived here, exactly where the sacred center ended and the rest of the city began. Some of that work required real coordination, more clearly than other parts of it, leveling a 40-acre plaza, raising a mound 100 feet tall, one basket at a time, building and rebuilding a palisade around the city's core. These are the clearest evidence of organized, directed labor, construction on a scale that doesn't happen without people agreeing or being compelled to work toward the same goal at the same time. A copper workshop or a long-distance exchange network is a different kind of evidence. It shows specialization and connection, but it doesn't by itself prove the same authority that organized mound building also ran the workshop or managed every trade route. Three different kinds of evidence sit behind the question of who ruled here, and each pulls in a slightly different direction. There's the labor itself, concentrated, monumental, clearly coordinated. There's the physical diversity of the city, multiple mound groups, distinct neighborhoods, evidence of people who'd grown up elsewhere, none of it looking like the product of one uniform plan stamped down from above. And there's the repeated ceremony and imagery running through the site, avian and human avian imagery, the beaded burials, symbols, and practices repeated across the wider Mississippian world. Different political models weigh these three kinds of evidence differently, which is a large part of why they disagree. How centralized was that coordination? Here, the archaeology runs out of easy answers, and researchers who've spent entire careers on this question still disagree. One reading, associated with Pawcatutt's own work, leans toward real centralization, authority concentrated enough to explain how a transformation this fast and this uniform could actually happen. Under this model, Cahokia looked something like a chiefdom, or perhaps something closer to an early state, with political power backing the city's rapid construction and enough authority to compel or persuade labor at a scale nothing in the region's earlier history had required. Other researchers propose different models entirely. Some describe Cahokia's political life as closer to a theater state, where power operated substantially through ceremony, spectacle, and public performance, a model that emphasizes ritual display, though it doesn't rule out coercion sitting alongside it. Others propose something closer to a coalition, power shared across several elite families or mound groups rather than concentrated in one office. Still others use the term heterarchy, authority distributed across multiple, sometimes overlapping centers of influence, rather than arranged in one clean hierarchy from top to bottom. with different kinds of power held by different people depending on context. Each of these models is trying to explain the same underlying evidence: the mounds, the plaza, the workshop, the trade goods. None of them is a wild guess. All of them are serious attempts by people who've spent careers with this material to answer a question. The evidence itself doesn't fully settle. Each reading explains part of the evidence well and leaves part of it unexplained. A strongly centralized reading is designed to explain the speed and uniformity of the Big Bang. It has a harder time explaining why so many separate mound groups across the site look independently significant rather than clearly subordinate to one dominant center. Cahokia was not, after all, uniformly organized in every visible respect. A more distributed reading, coalition, heterarchy, shared elite power, explains that multiplicity more naturally. Speed alone doesn't settle the argument either way. Distributed systems can act quickly, and centralized ones can struggle to coordinate. The real test is which model accounts for more of what's actually in the ground. This isn't a question. Professional archaeologists, working directly with the evidence for decades, have resolved themselves. What can be said plainly, at different moments across roughly 2 centuries, whoever or whatever held authority here was substantial enough to organize monumental construction. That authority's exact shape and how consistent it stayed from one moment to the next remain genuinely open questions, argued over by people who've spent their entire careers trying to answer them. That uncertainty isn't a failure of the archaeology. It's an honest reflection of what a 1,000-year-old society without its own writing can actually tell us, and what it can't. In 1967, archaeologist Melvin Fowler began excavating a small ridgetop mound, roughly half a mile south of Monk's Mound. He chose this mound partly because of its unusual orientation, angled differently from most of Cahokia's other mounds, aligned instead with the solstice sunrise and sunset. What he found inside would shape how the world understood Cahokia for the next 50 years, in ways that later turned out to need real correction. At the center of what became known as Mound 72, Fowler uncovered 2 primary bodies laid on a bed of thousands of shell beads, along with several other individuals bundled and buried nearby as part of the same central feature, including a child. Around this central burial lay others, arranged with clear care and preparation. Nearby, in separate pits, lay something more disturbing still. Groups of individuals, dozens at a time, in what appeared to be mass graves. Over the full excavation, more than 270 individuals were eventually recovered from this one mound. Fowler's original interpretation became the standard account for decades. The 2 central bodies, he believed, were high-status males, possibly linked to a mythological figure some call the Birdman, based partly on the bead arrangement's outline. The mass graves nearby were read as sacrificial burials. That reading was grounded in real evidence, including clear signs of violent trauma in some of the graves. It wasn't invented from nothing. The original identification of several burial groups as entirely female came from genuine osteological analysis, using the methods available at the time, not a casual guess. Where later retellings overreached, was in how confidently they built on that identification. Many popular accounts described the victims specifically as young women, killed to accompany powerful men into death, treating a period-appropriate but ultimately incomplete analysis as far more certain than it was. For decades, that specific version was simply the story Mound 72 told, repeated in book after book, documentary after documentary, until it became difficult to find an account of Cahokia that told it any other way. Starting in the early 2000s, that story began to come apart, not through speculation, but through direct re-examination of the bones themselves. Later, researchers applied new odontometric models, new measurements, and independent osteological reassessments to remains and records recovered by the earlier project. A 2013 study used tooth measurements, a useful probabilistic method for estimating sex, whose accuracy depends on the population and comparative sample used, to reanalyze several of Mound 72's mass burial groups. 4 groups that had previously been described as entirely female turned out to include males as well. Not every individual across every grave was reclassified, but the specific claim of all female sacrificial groups, repeated confidently for decades, did not hold up under this closer, independent look. In 2016, a team led by archaeologist Thomas Emerson conducted new, independent analysis of the central beaded burial itself. It drew on newer dental and osteological methods beyond what Fowler's original excavation project had used, corroborated by separate osteological work supporting the revised identifications. Their finding overturned the core of Fowler's original reading. The 2 central bodies were not 2 males. They were a male and a female, buried together. Several of the surrounding burials, previously read as solitary retainers, turned out to be paired male-female burials as well. Even the bead bed's original bird outline, the visual basis for the Birdman reading, has itself been questioned in this reanalysis, undercutting not just who was buried there, but the very image that gave the burial its popular name. This wasn't a minor correction. Fowler's reading had become, as Emerson and colleagues later put it, the model shaping how archaeologists across the eastern United States understood status, gender, and ritual in Mississippian society generally. A great deal of downstream interpretation across an entire field had been built on an original identification that turned out to be wrong. Emerson and his colleagues now propose a different reading, that Mound 72's central burial relates less to one ruler's personal power and more to ritual practices tied to renewal and fertility. They draw this reading partly through comparison with creation traditions documented among Plains Prairie Native peoples, especially Caddo tradition. It's a specific comparative analogy, not a claim about one broad, documented body of Mississippian belief. It's their interpretation, offered as a replacement for the old one, not a new, settled consensus the way the old story once was, wrongly treated as settled. One more thing worth being careful about: when this mound was actually built. Excavations show Mound 72 wasn't raised in a single episode. Its story unfolds in a clearer sequence than it grew over time alone suggests. It began before the year 1000, with a set of tall wooden posts and a small charnel structure associated with burials. The elaborate central burial came next, the two primary bodies on their bed of shell beads, along with the others buried alongside them. That was added sometime before 1050, right at the edge of Cahokia's coming transformation, rather than clearly inside it. The mass graves came later still, in a series of separate burial events. The primary chronology groups those mass burial events together with the mound's final construction and capping, broadly across roughly 1050 to 1150. That's not one late, separate act generations afterward. It's part of the same extended sequence. So this isn't one mystery frozen at one moment. It's closer to several. Who built the first posts and charnel house? Who the central pair actually were? And who filled the mass graves and ultimately sealed the whole complex during that same broad span between 1050 and 1150. That bird-associated imagery, however uncertain its exact form here, has been connected by some researchers to imagery found much later, hundreds of miles away, at the Mississippian Mound Center of Spiro. Archaeologist James Brown is the researcher most associated with drawing that connection. It's an interpretive comparison across time and distance, not proof that the Cahokia bead field depicted the same figure or carried the same meaning as anything found at a site built generations afterward. Whatever this symbolism meant here, treating the Spiro comparison as settled fact would overstate what a visual resemblance, on its own, can establish. Mound 72 has already forced archaeologists to abandon one confidently held story about it. It may still be holding on to others no one has fully worked out yet, a reminder that even a site as extensively excavated as this one can still surprise the people who return to it with better tools and harder questions. Around 1175, Cahokia's builders enclosed the central precinct behind a massive wooden wall, reinforced at intervals with bastions positioned for defense. Cahokia's decline unfolded over generations after this point, and it left behind real evidence of how those generations became harder to live through. Evidence written into sediment and into the wall itself. The wall was rebuilt more than once over the following decades, each version following roughly the same course. Real, sustained investment in a structure that defense alone explains well. It likely wasn't only about defense, though. A wall like this also marks a boundary, separating an inner precinct from everything outside it. And that separation may have carried social or sacred weight independent of any actual threat. Something, by this point, had changed enough that the city's builders enclosed their own center, whether from outside danger, internal division, or the act of marking what mattered most as distinct from what surrounded it. What exactly drove that decision is not something the structure alone can settle. The environment around Cahokia was shifting during this same broad period, though the shifts didn't all happen at once, and it's worth keeping them separate rather than folding them into one simple story of decline. Sediment cores from floodplain lakes near the site show that the centuries of Cahokia's rise, roughly 600 to 1200, appear in one major sediment study as an unusually flood-free stretch for this part of the Mississippi. That reduced risk of catastrophic flooding, where it held, likely mattered for a city this dependent on its harvests. Though the record doesn't rule out smaller floods or localized drainage problems along the way. That same study finds large floods returning to the floodplain sometime after 1200. A separate study, using a different record, identifies reduced warm season precipitation together with a large flood around 1150, close to an early stage of Cahokia's population decline, but not necessarily the same event described in the post-1200 flood record above. The two studies use different samples and different age models. Rather than treat them as one clean date, the honest picture is two related but distinct pieces of evidence, pointing to environmental instability building across the 12th and 13th centuries without settling on a single moment it began. Later still, during the final phase of the city's abandonment, sometime around 1350 to 1400, a more severe and sustained drought appears in a third, separate record. Each study covers a different chronology, but together they point toward the same broad picture: environmental instability arriving in stages, not as one continuous decline on a city that may already have been under other kinds of strain. One popular explanation for Cahokia's decline deserves a direct look, because researchers actually went and tested it. For years, a common account held that Cahokia's own residents caused their own flooding problem, that clearing upland forests for construction and fuel led to erosion, which in turn caused more frequent local flooding on the floodplain below. It's a tidy story, a civilization undone by its own environmental footprint. A team of researchers led by Caitlin Rankin tested that story directly by examining the actual soil layers around a Cahokia-era mound for the specific stratigraphic signature that erosion-driven flooding should have left behind. They didn't find it. The buried soil they examined remained stable, without the sediment pattern the deforestation account predicts. That doesn't prove deforestation never happened, or that it had no effect anywhere in the region. The test covered one location, not every drainage across the floodplain. But at the specific spot they examined, the claim that clearing drove Cahokia's own local flooding didn't hold up against the ground itself. A dramatic, often repeated explanation, tested at one real location and found wanting there, rather than simply hedged. There's also evidence of rising interpersonal violence in this broader era, though it needs to be placed carefully. The clearest evidence for that violence comes from the central Illinois River Valley, a related but separate region north of Cahokia, where skeletal remains show a real, measurable increase in trauma consistent with conflict. Researchers studying that specific evidence are explicit that the picture at Cahokia itself is less clear. It would be a mistake to treat regional violence as direct proof of conflict inside the city, however tempting that connection might be for a tidier story. The honest answer is that the evidence from the two places doesn't automatically transfer, and treating it as though it does would misrepresent what's actually been found. No single cause explains what happened next. Flooding, drought, social strain, and quite possibly shifting political authority may have interacted at different stages over roughly a century and a half. Not necessarily all at once, different pressures likely arrived, eased, and returned at different points across that long decline, potentially making each other harder to absorb whenever they did overlap. A single bad flood might have been survivable on its own. A single difficult drought on its own might have been weathered too. Whether pressures like these actually did overlap for any given household in any given year is more than the surviving records can say. What they support is a plausible pattern of accumulating strain, not a single recovered sequence of events everyone in the city lived through the same way. By around 1350, the core ceremonial city had been substantially abandoned. The plaza that may once have held major gatherings stood empty. The workshops fell silent. Whatever authority had once organized work at monumental scale no longer had the population, or perhaps the standing, to direct anything at that scale. It's worth pausing on what abandonment actually means here, because it isn't the same as us people vanishing. A falling population at one location doesn't erase the people who lived there. Depopulation like this generally involves movement, people carrying some of what they knew into other communities, in other places. Though archaeology can't yet trace exactly which knowledge, which kinship ties, or which specific practices made that journey with them. Sediment and archaeological evidence suggest the wider watershed reached a real population minimum around 1400, with signs of renewed indigenous population by roughly 1500, likely tied to communities later part of the broader Illinois Confederation. That rebound, and exactly how to interpret it, has itself been questioned by subsequent research. It isn't a fully settled picture. The debate over what those later population signals actually mean is still active among the archaeologists who study this specific stretch of the record, working from the same sediment and site data but not always reaching the same conclusions from it. What is clearer is where the story leads afterward. The Osage Nation and the Quapaw Nation both maintain their own histories, tracing Degiha origins connected to this broader region, passed down through generations of oral tradition, and preserved today through their own tribal historic preservation offices. These are tribal accounts of cultural and historical connection, distinct from, and not reducible to, a simple biological genealogy that archaeology alone could confirm or deny. They deserve to be treated as sources in their own right, not as decoration added to an archaeological conclusion. The city emptied. Native peoples and histories of connection to this land endured. By the time settlers of European descent arrived in this stretch of the Mississippi Valley in real numbers, Cahokia's mounds had stood empty for centuries, weathered by rain and grown over with prairie grass. Some of these newcomers recognized deliberate construction when they saw it. Many others, and the dominant tradition that took hold in print and popular belief, did not, or refused to. And a telling thing happened. Rather than accept that the ancestors of the native peoples they were actively displacing had built these structures, many 19th century Americans decided they could not have. The resulting theories ranged from mistaken to genuinely absurd, overlapping mound builder and Old World origin claims, not one single identical theory. Some credited the mounds to wandering Vikings, who supposedly became the builders of Mexico's Toltec civilization. Others pointed to the lost tribes of Israel wandering across the ocean and somehow ending up in the Mississippi Valley. Still others invoked ancient Egyptians, Welsh explorers, Phoenicians, or, when even those explanations ran out, the lost continent of Atlantis. These weren't fringe ideas whispered at the edges of respectable thought. Some were argued seriously, in print, by writers who considered themselves careful and reasonable. Many of these theories shared an unstated premise: that the native nations actually living in and around these mounds were somehow incapable of having built them. This served a real political purpose, documented by historians of the period. It arrived alongside the forced removal of native peoples from ancestral lands across the eastern half of the continent, and a myth that erased indigenous achievement made that removal easier to justify. If the mounds belonged to some vanished, unrelated people, then the living nations being displaced had no deep, inconvenient history tying them to this land. Not everyone who believed the myth necessarily reasoned it through this consciously, but the pattern, at the level of the broader culture, served dispossession directly. The myth did not survive contact with careful archaeology. Late in the 19th century, the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology directed a systematic survey of mounds across the United States, with Cyrus Thomas trained as a botanist and entomologist before turning to this work, heading the division of mound exploration that carried it out. His 1894 report reached a clear conclusion. The evidence pointed overwhelmingly to Native American builders, rejecting the idea of any separate, vanished mound-building race. It was an inconvenient finding for a culture invested in believing otherwise, and it was published anyway. Within mainstream archaeology, the question was now effectively settled. Outside the field, the older story kept circulating for years, in books and popular belief that never caught up with what Thomas had actually found. Mounds around the region continued to be leveled through the rest of the 1800s, and one case shows exactly what that destruction actually looked like. Across the river, in what is now downtown St. Louis, stood a mound so large residents simply called it Big Mound, one of the largest earthworks in the entire St. Louis precinct of Greater Cahokia. In 1869, it was demolished, its earth dug apart and hauled away as the growing city expanded over its own ancient ground. There was no confusion about what it was by then. Thomas's report was still decades away, but plenty of people already understood these were built structures, not natural hills. It was leveled anyway. Evidence, it turned out, was never really the obstacle. Cahokia itself survived, though not by any guarantee. In the 1920s, archaeologist Warren Moorhead conducted serious excavation and mapping at the site, and pushed successfully for its preservation. Cahokia's indigenous origins were already established science by this point. Moorhead's real contribution was fieldwork, documentation, and public advocacy that helped keep the site intact against the same pressures that had already destroyed so many mounds nearby, at a moment when its future was genuinely uncertain. Decades later, Melvin Fowler's 1960s excavations, including at Mound 72, transformed scholarly understanding of the site, building on investigation and preservation efforts that had already been underway for decades before him. The copper workshop described earlier was first identified by archaeologist Gregory Perino in 1956. Later, researchers relocated and remapped the site, reopened excavation there, and examined the copper itself through metallographic analysis and hands-on replication. Work that confirmed and deepened Perino's original identification, each generation adding to, correcting, and occasionally overturning the one before it. Research at Cahokia continues today. The University of Illinois' NAGPRA project works with tribal nations and descendant communities on the ancestors, funerary belongings, and other collections held from the site. Consultation, repatriation, and care carried out as an ongoing institutional relationship, not a closed chapter from a century ago. Cahokia was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1982, one of a small number of places on Earth recognized for its outstanding testimony to human history. Return for a moment to where this story began. Monk's Mound still stands, 100 feet of packed earth over a quiet Illinois floodplain. Who built it, and that it mattered deeply to the people who did, was never seriously in doubt once the evidence was actually examined. What nearly buried that evidence a second time wasn't the passage of centuries. It was a choice many institutions and writers kept making, sustained across generations and documented in the historical record, not to believe what the ground was saying, a pattern that outlasted the evidence meant to correct it by decades, sometimes by more than a century. Much about Cahokia remains genuinely unresolved. Who held power? What its rituals fully meant? Exactly how its final decades unfolded. That's not a gap in this story. It's an honest place to leave it, and honest is worth more here than tidy. The mound remembers what it can. The rest is still being recovered. One careful excavation, one re-examined burial, one rechecked assumption at a time. Thank you for drifting with us tonight. New journeys every week.